evening. Good to have you with us on this edition of the Urban Debate. Tonight we bring you the story of how there is a turf war brewing within the armed forces about the future plan, part of which is already in play. A lot more will be implemented in the coming times. This is the plan of integrated commands, a concept to integrate capabilities of the three armed forces, the Army, the Air Force and the Navy. Now, the Indian Air Force has been expressing concerns over this model. There's been quite a bit of resistance from there. But what has triggered the latest round of exchange of words in this turf war really has started from the Chief of the Defence Staff, General Bipin Rawat, making these comments where he said that Air Force remains a supporting arm, continues to remain a supporting arm. Indian Air Force plays the role of a supporting arm to the rest of the ground forces, just like the artillery or the engineers play the support role for the combat units. Now, this didn't go down well with the Air Chief. And Air Chief Marshal, Mr. Bhadauria, said that not a supporting role alone. This is not all that the Air Force does. We have a huge role to play. Air Marshal Bhadauria responded to the comments made by General Bipin Rawat. Now, what is this integrated plan? Essentially, there is now a plan to bring in a 5-command structure by 2023. These will be integrated commands, essentially a combination of Indian Army, Air Force and Navy. Currently, all these have their own commands and region systems across the country. But these will then be combined. Phase 1, which is in play right now, has the Maritime and the Air Defence Theatre Command being put in place in 2 different locations. Phase 2, we understand, is likely to be announced in the coming few months, which will be creation of the other 3 integrated theatre commands. Now, what are the sticky points, especially from the viewpoint of the Air Force? The division of air assets. They say that this gets divided and the power goes away, to which General Rawat has said that's not true. Even now, your air assets are divided into the various commands that are under the Air Force. The nomenclature of these commands, the jurisdiction, who gets to be the leader and the leader of each of these commands, will that become a problem between the 3 forces? Will the power of the chiefs really go away? All of those have been, conversations that have been going on for a while now. So let's try and put this in perspective and understand how big is this a problem? Will more come our way as we go about setting this new system in? Is it right? Is it fair for anyone to say that one of these is a supporting arm, that the Army is the key and it's the Air Force which has to be the supporting arm, providing the support system to the Army? Is it being read out of context? Was it being explained in a larger context, and is this now being taken in some other way? Going forward, is there a genuine concern that one force, the Army maybe, has a bigger say and a bigger pull than the Air Force and the Navy when decisions are taken? When the systems get integrated, does one of these forces come up on the top over the other 2? Is there why there is resistance? Can we avoid that, or does it really matter at the end of the day if the view is that together they need to work in the interest of our country? Let's talk about this and say good evening General Satish Dua, former Corps Commander, for joining us this evening. Air Chief Marshal Fali Major joins us this evening as well. Maroof Raza, Strategic Affairs Expert and Consulting Editor to Times Network, and Manu Pabi, Senior Editor for Economic Times, with me as well. Let me actually start off with Air Chief Marshal Fali Major. So, to your mind, what General Bipin Rawat said, should it have been said in those words, or is it being taken out of context?
Well, as a military man, I will not and never comment on somebody else's statement. But if it is a matter of finding out if the Indian Air Force, the fourth largest air force in the world, is a supporting arm, I do not agree. Air power today has a role which is unimaginable. It has been very often said over the past few decades that in today's warfare, it'll perhaps be air power which will decide the victor or the vanquished in a classical conflict. Also, in today's unconventional hybrid warfare scenario, the amount of destruction and the amount of clandestine work that can be done from above and without seen is quite a lot. And of course, when we talk of a supporting arm or a supporting service, someone is supported and someone supports. Whether it's the Army, Navy, or the Air Force, or whether there are arms and services within the services. And therefore, in the Indian Air Force, we don't have a distinction between arms and services. Every single person in the Indian Air Force is an air warrior. And therefore, we respect the core competencies of every single person and learn from their contribution and their expertise to enhance the force. That is what I have to say as far as the comments you mentioned by the CDS.
So let me just also bring in General Dua, and then we'll go to the larger aspect of what is being planned and if there are legitimate concerns there about protecting each turf. But General Dua, do you think that what General Rawat said is being taken out of context? For example, he tries to explain it in a way where he says, just like the artillery or even the engineers is supporting the combat troops on ground, similarly, that's what Air Force's charter is. What's your view?
Let me start by saying that these are the times when we are in the process of integrating the three services by an order of the government, and some timelines have been laid. There is bound to be churning. There are bound to be differences between the three services. But let us also remember that it is not a contest. We are all on the same side, and our goal is the security of the country. And I'm sure no military officer will disagree with that. Having said that, let me also make a small point before I take up the question squarely, is that it is good that we are having this churning before rather than later. Disagreements will be there. They will be resolved. Now, in this particular case, like the Air Chief said very rightly, in every operation, somebody will be supported and somebody will be supporting. Let's take the case of, let's say, an air defense, like an air defense command is being planned. In air defense, any capabilities and assets that the Indian Army holds will be only supporting whatever the Air Force decides how they have to be enmeshed together. In a particular operation, in a land operation, we get the air support very correctly, and we cannot move without the air support. Every service, like the Air Chief rightly brought out, that every asset of theirs is an air warrior, regardless of whatever trade or whatever job he performs. In a similar manner, every service has its own way of doing things, or its own terminologies, or its own understanding and perspectives. In the Indian Army, we do talk about fighting arms, supporting arms, services separately, and we classified them as such. this was a debate which has been taken to the press. I really wish that we should have had this without the press and the public domain. And I'm sure, like the Air Chief Marshal Bhadauria very correctly said also in his statement. And then we will discuss it further amongst ourselves. So I suppose we need to leave it there rather than make much of a particular statement or statements and their rebuttals that have come out in public domain.
Okay, so let's see it from another perspective, Manu, and that is that, you know, when you make a major change and any big reform really comes in, there will always be, you know, few hiccups here and there, difference of opinions and stuff. So let's explain to our viewers what is this change that we are talking about. You know, for those who don't track it very closely, it's simply the fact that some time ago we created the post of a CDS. Now we're talking about integrated commands, and there seems to be some friction here.
See, the bigger picture is that, you know, we have decided to form these integrated commands in which, you know, all three services will combine their assets and work under one commander. The whole aim is basically right now that you have an Air Force which works separately, an Army and a Navy which works separately. And a lot of time, there are a lot of efforts which are, duplicated by these guys. And the idea is to combine all the forces together. This is a formula that's applied in almost all modern militaries, be it in the US, the UK, even the PLA has a similar concept. And this is a concept which has long been in discussion. In fact, it was first mooted after the 1999 Kargil War in 2001. That was when the first serious discussion started on this. It's taken more than 20 years for this to come through. Now, the problem is not that somebody's against the theater commands per se. Everyone in the services, all the three chiefs, when you speak to them, the CDS, they're all the same. They all agree that theater command is the way to go. The disagreement, and a very public one now, is on how to formulate it. And there are many different ways to do it. What is unusual, that is what our viewers should understand, is that there are disagreements in the armed forces, quite a lot. In fact, they are very, very critical about each other behind closed doors. And that's how a lot of the good stuff happens there. But it is almost, impossible. It's very, very rare to see a public commentary on internal matters. And this happened over the creation of these, not on the creation, but on the structure of these theaters. So that, I think, to my mind, points out some serious rift. I don't recall, in the past 10, 15 years, army chiefs or top military leaders coming out in public, making statements, pulling some other force down or putting out the point of view on something which has been discussed internally. So what this tells us, as a outside viewer, is that there's a lot of turmoil within the forces on the creation of these commands, on the structure of this command. And I think the Air Force has some valid points. There are others who have valid points. The problem is consensus does not seem to be coming. And the government seems to be working towards a particular deadline, which a lot of people are warning that when you do such a huge, large-scale change, you should not work towards a deadline, but you need to work by getting everyone together on one platform and thinking it through. I think a lot of the problem that you see is that the push-through is coming because of some sort of a deadline in mind. And I think that's what I think the Air Force has been saying in the past. The CDS's comments, to my mind, seem to be, an outlet to what he's been facing. So he made these comments, unfortunately, publicly, but that just shows that there is a lot of frustration over this thing getting stuck as of now.
Okay, so just to explain this further, let's take one of the commands as an example and then say, where Air Force or even the Army may see certain issues in terms of the planning or the division of power and assets.
See, the basic plan is that you will have, 4 major commands. There will be one command to the west, which will face Pakistan. There will be one command to the east, which is facing China. Then there's the maritime command, which is basically the entire Navy. And there will be a northern command. In my mind, the biggest problem that I see already here is the northern commands. In the structuring of integrated theater groups, they are leaving northern command out. They're saying that there will be no integration of assets there as of now. It will be left alone. Now, the Northern Command is the place where all the operations actually happen. That is being left to its old structure of the Army and the Air Force being separate. But the people are experts and even insiders in the Army are pointing out that in Northern Command is a place where you really need joint operations. We've seen that in Balakot, Air Force and the Army working together in tandem. In many, many other aspects, when there's a drone attack, both forces involved. I'll give you another example from the Air Force's point of view. Look at the Western Command. And under the new structure, the Western Command will come under the Indian Army. There will be an Army general, a 3-star general who will look after it. and the Air Force person will act as an advisor to the Army General directing operations in the West. Now, towards Pakistan. Now, the problem the Air Force foresees here is that they think that future conflicts will not be land-driven only. They will have an Air Force component, and the planning and the way they want to approach it should be left to the Air Force guy who's more competent in understanding how to carry out those offensive operations. They don't see their role only as an air defense institution. And the Air Force right now is only getting one command, is the Air Defense Command. The Air Force is much more than that, and that's why they're asking that there should be equal representation. As things stand, both the Eastern and the Western Command will be headed by an Army General. Now, in other countries, in the UK and the US, these are tri-services commands. They can be commanded by the Army in one end, by the Air Force in the other end. But here, I think because it's land-centric, it's going to be the Army. So there is a lot of confusion. There's a lot of problem over who will report to whom, whose thinking will be predominant. The Air Force point of view is that future conflict will be fought at standoff distances. They will not be a close contact warfare like large-scale tank battles that we've seen in the World War II. They think the future of conflict is what is like something like Israel, where you are lobbing rockets at each other at long distances and not real contact of troops.
Right.
And there they see that the Army taking a lead role is perhaps not the best idea. That's their point of view.
Okay. Now, before I go to Maroof, because I see Air Chief Marshal Fali Major does have a view on what is being said here, but Air Chief Marshal, there is a point here to say, well, when you say there is a core combat unit and everybody else is a support unit, to categorize Air Force as support arm is ancient. A lot of the core combat is perhaps now being done by Air Force and not the ground troops somewhere sitting deep inside the mainland.
Tanvi, I don't know who the gentleman was who spoke before me just now. I firmly believe in one thing. We have very competent military leadership in all three services. And all that we are discussing on this TV channel, you and all of us, is only, what is available to us in the open. We are not privy to anything what is actually being discussed and what is being planned. And to make sweeping statements about, how a command is going to turn out, what is it going to be, its contents, etc., I think is rather immature on our part. After 40 years in the Air Force, I understand the service very well, you'll agree. So will the general. But every change which takes place in the armed force, it's very dynamic. It's very dynamic because depending on the threats, on the world order, on many other issues. And what is being discussed in those closed conference rooms and war rooms is not privy to anyone else. And to make statements about what is being decided as to how these commands are going to be formed, when they're going to be formed, is something we should leave it to the present political and military leadership to decide, and not us on TV channels. I may know a lot from my experience as to what might be happening, but it would be stupid on my part to discuss it on a television channel.
Right. So may I just, Air Chief Marshal, may I just point one thing out? Absolutely. I don't think any of us are saying this is what should happen. I mean, not at least us, between me or Manu at all, that we would leave to the experts. But Manu Bhabi is a senior editor with Economic Times, and I think the information that he is sharing and the insights he is sharing is basis what he's learned from constantly tracking the situation for several years now. So on what are the conversations right now that he has picked up on? That's where the information is coming from. It could change as conversations go along. And, before the final decisions are made by the government and announced. So I get the point that you're making there, but this is where the situation stands right now.
Okay.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay, I understand what you say, and I respect his journalistic expertise. But what I'm trying to say is I'm not casting any aspersions on what he said. But what I'm trying to say is that all issues, for the past few days, every webinar, every newspaper, every TV channel is discussing what came out on the TV by the CDS and the air chief. But let me tell you one thing. The general also mentioned that we don't know under what context, under what circumstances all these things have come out. It shouldn't have come out. I mean, I still insist it shouldn't have come out on TV. But be that as it may, what matters now is, and my prayer as a former chief is, that the present leadership should constitute and form these theater commands, if they are to be formed, in a manner which will strengthen the present system and not create more hassles.
Okay.
And I'm sure that is their aim. And if they stick to that and do it well, it'll be good. But to discuss the nitty-gritties as to how, an air defense command should come up or should not come up on a TV channel, I think these are matters of national security, and we should pay due diligence while discussing these issues.
No, I understand what you're saying. So, in fact,
I think that, openly talking about, how an air defense command will operate or a land theater command will operate, etc., in my reckoning, is not correct. Yes, generally speaking, all I want to say is that they should get, the government and the armed forces should get this great reformation taking place in the armed forces correctly, precisely, and effectively to enhance our war-fighting capability and enhance our national security. As long as this is ensured,
right,
then whatever way it goes would be fine.
Right. I understand what you're saying. In fact, and I know that for those who served in the armed forces, it's very painful to see when the internal conversations actually come out or are discussed in the open. And the point, though, here, Maroof, is it has come out in the open, and we were not the ones to bring it out. It was chosen by the General Rawat and Air Chief Marshal Bhadauria to speak about it and respond. So now it's out. So now let's try and understand what's going on. Maroof, your view.
See, Tanvi, the Air Chief Marshal has obviously aired the sensitivities that exist in service headquarters and the worries that they have about how much should be exposed or discussed in the public domain. Therefore, the military has always been wary of this animal called media. It often walks on thin ice when it engages with the media, and a situation like this gets them to clamp up later on, whatever the outcome of this be. But really, what we need to understand is a couple of important issues. I have been an advocate of theater commands in my own humble, limited way, having first written about it in 1994 in one of my books, that this is the way the civil-military relations and command and control in the large military sphere should eventually be orchestrated. 3-4 years ago, I again wrote about it and spelled it about it in great detail before it came out in the public domain that this is what's going to happen. Now, if it is a political directive, I think it is the job of the political leadership to now follow the debate and say that this has to be implemented, as the Air Chief brought out, or General Dua brought out, that since the Kargil Review Committee also proposed that, any sensible observer of South Asian security and the Indian military establishment will tell you that we have this bizarre situation that we have 17 commands to humor the ego of our general officers, air marshals, and admirals. So everybody at some stage aspires for another bigger chanda, another batti on his gadi, and that kind of importance. But I want to ask 3 questions with regard to, I am not disputing what the distinguished Air Chief has said. Neither Air Chief Marshal Fali Major nor his successor, Air Chief Marshal Bhadauria. What I'm saying is that the Air Force has long argued that they don't want to become part of the theater command narrative because they don't want their limited resources, which is anyway going down because we've taken long to acquire more fighter aircrafts. They don't want it further distributed into commands. But I support what Manu was saying because I myself argued that there should have been a land-centric command from Gujarat to Kashmir and from Kashmir to Myanmar, dealing with China and Pakistan too separately, a strategic forces or an air defense command, they call it air defense now, and a maritime command, which I called a peninsula command. The point at issue is, you've got an Air Force command in Shillong, suppose. Now, you want more resources to take on a maritime engagement because we are becoming increasingly part of the Indo-Pacific. And supposing the theater of conflict shifts to the Indian Ocean or the Arabian Sea, how are you going to, is the Air Force Chief going to coordinate with the AOC in Shillong to say, send 4 more fighters or 8 more fighters to support the Maritime Command? And at that time, suddenly the situation begins to get out of hand with China. And with China, your conflict situation is going to be both in the Himalayas and in the Indian Ocean. So who's going to decide where more fighter aircrafts go? I'm not disputing the fact that the Air Chief said that we are not a supporting arm. Fair enough, you're not a supporting arm. In fact, you, as Balakot strike showed, and many others have shown, that the Air Force can actually change the narrative completely that exists in South Asia, that you cannot cross Pakistan's airspace and not meet with resistance. It crossed, it gave them a hit on their nose, and it came back. It was a great success for India, and the Air Force is obviously made us all very proud. But please remember that saying something is supporting an operation, it depends on the nature of operations you're going to fight.
Okay.
If your thinking is entirely in a defensive, offensive mode, then you would need supporting arms like the artillery in Kargil to push out the invaders from those heights, or the engineers in the offensive role when in the Bangladesh operations you needed to cross all those rivers to get to Dhaka.
Okay.
So all these operations are military operations. A terminology here and there doesn't change the nature or the capability of the force. And finally, and most importantly, we must understand that we need to compress our resources because they are spread too wide and too thin. Do you know that China has only one theater command looking over all of India, right from Xinjiang on to Myanmar? And we have probably, I think, 8 to 10 commands looking at China from various directions. So who's going to take the shot? Who's going to take the call? Whose operational command will it come under? And will the maritime admiral not require troops on the ground to capture an island off the coast of Andamans? He will require troops on the ground. That's where he needs an army officer to advise him. Just like an Air Force Air Marshal would need understanding from the army on the front line that where does he position his resources to take on an air defense threat to India, whether it's in Delhi or elsewhere. So, there is a need for integration. And I'll tell you, historically, there are 2 anecdotal incidents where this whole theater command, tamasha, has been going on for 50 years. After the 71 war, Mrs. Gandhi wanted to make Sam Manekshaw the CDS.
Yeah.
You can check history books. Air Chief Marshal P.C. Lal, great man, but he overruled it. And in more recent years also, the Air Force has come out and said, we don't need further integration. We don't need, theater commands. We don't need a CDS. I mean, grow up.
Okay, so let me,
Maroof, need to defend India.
Right. Fair enough.
Whatever is required to defend India, we should put it into use. We have the resources, but sab apni jagir guard kar rahe hain.
But I'm assuming there is no easy answer to how to go about it. Everybody has the nation's best interest in mind. How do you go about it is a different matter. Air Chief Marshal, I know you wanted to come in, but if I can just bring in General Dua before that as well. General Dua, Manu was also mentioning this. other countries have unified integrated commands, but they work differently. Now, if the hurdle is that who's going to be heading each of these commands and then thereby who has more control or power, can we look at those models for an easier solution?
Look, India is rather late in the embarking on this journey to jointness or integration. 66 countries have integrated their militaries before we started doing this. But every country has its own peculiar requirements, needs, and aspirations. What works for US is in an expeditionary mode, will not work for us. What works for UK, it has such great joint structures, but they don't have enemy on their own borders. They are islands. So they are doing it like as an expeditionary force when they have to deploy forces in other parts of the world. Whereas India has, on the other hand, has no expeditionary aspirations. We have unresolved borders on our land frontiers itself. And we have two neighbors, both of which are nuclear countries. And we have very active borders. When I say active borders, I know everyone knows that there is a LOC where firing takes place constantly. The LAC, which used to be more of shoving and pushing earlier, but now last year we have seen that we have come to a pass where we've had casualties on both sides. So what I'm trying to say, our requirements are peculiar to our own country context and the world order or the regional order here. And that is why we cannot lift off or copy a model from any of those countries. And that is the reason why the government has taken this bold step of telling us, and that is now, it is beyond discussion. Orders have been given, CDS has been appointed, timelines have been laid. Sure enough, if we cannot manage by a certain timeline, if we cannot operationalize by a timeline, then perhaps they will have to go back to the government and say we need more time. We also must remember that we have active borders with both these countries. Issues in Ladakh are not yet resolved. LOC is still going on. So we cannot be sort of off balance at any stage. Hence, great caution has to be exercised. And the discussions that are taking place, much more is happening than that has come out in the media in the last couple of days because of a particular webinar or seminar and which led to some of the discussions, like the Air Chief also agreed. And I said earlier, I'm sure even Maroof as an ex-military man will agree that it is actually better that these discussions are left out of public domain and out of press. Let them be decided across the table, which I'm sure they are. And we will come out with a better model to suit our particular needs.
Fair enough. I completely respect what you're saying here. Yes, Air Chief Marshal, you wanted to come in earlier and make a point?
I wanted to say almost exactly what the General just mentioned, that, you know, for the past many decades, there have been many proposals for the, you know, reformation of the Indian Armed Forces. Sorry, Maroof, I didn't know it was you on the other side. I see some different name here, Satya Prasad or something. So I didn't know who the other panelist was. What I'm trying to say is that there has been rather many attempts for various forms of jointness. But I believe that jointness basically emanates from joint thinking, joint planning, and joint execution of tasks. Also, we sometimes carry this jointness a little too far because every single operation, especially in today's scenario, will not be a joint operation. There'll be many single service operations. And therefore, the formation of theater commands should facilitate such operations also. In the case of the Indian Air Force, I mean, everyone says, okay, what the hell, even now, we transfer assets from one command to the other. That is correct. But please remember that with theater commands, if you have to relocate your air bases and things, depending where they go, it will be a huge expenditure on the government. Because today's aeroplanes, their support structures are created in a manner in one particular place, which are very, very expensive, very sophisticated. You can't keep moving them around. Secondly, the Indian Air Force already has deployed their squadrons and certain heavy and important assets in a manner that they can be moved anywhere in a theater of war. So what I'm trying to say is that while theater commands, like the General said, has already been accepted and it's on the way, we need to be very, very careful about these aspects. And we should not be in a hurry to implement it, like he said, to meet deadlines and things like that. Think about it and do it the right way, as the Air Chief had said that day, because that is what matters. I mean, this discussing formation of theater command, CDS, etc. is history. Let us talk how well we do it. And there can be no better person than the present Air Chief himself, who says that the Air Force is not against theater commands. It is just that it wants to resolve some issues before you actually form them and make them a potent fighting force.
Yes, Maroof, go ahead. Manu, I'm coming to you next. Yeah.
Air Chief Marshal Major, who I've had the privilege to know, is a very, he's a very informed and educated person, and he comes across with a lot of merit for the point he's making. Just a couple of things that we need for the viewer to understand. That, what is this bickering about resources? Please understand. I'll give you a hypothetical example. You're going on an expedition. War is like an expedition. You need to know what are the resources that are going to be available to you, where you will get your replenishment of resources, whether it's ammunition in military terms, or it is food, or where the mule supply will come with water for your long drawn out Himalayan expedition. So the commander of the expedition or the captain of the team needs to plan based on resources that he can actually plan on to achieve his strategic objectives or even tactical objectives. Now, the problem that has come in with the services, and this is not a problem of today, this is a problem because everyone had adopted an ostrich-like attitude that we will deal with the problem when it will come, but right now we need to have our own doctrines. So Manu will agree with me, and the General and the Air Marshal will also agree that the three services had their own doctrines. And I dare say they seem to be ready to go to war independent of the other two services. Now that is not how you plan to defend the country. I'm not casting aspersions on their commitment to defending the country. But the fact of the matter is, there are so many watertight compartments. We complain about civil-military barriers that are there in South Block. There are a lot of barriers within the services. I don't want to start washing laundry in public.
Yes.
But if you look back at historical accounts of what happened in 71 and which chief was communicating with which chief, then you'll get to know that we are still lucky we got away with a great victory. The worry for me is that we now need to shed the baggage of the past and look at the promise of the future. I will keep emphasizing on this every time this kind of a debate comes up. Manu.
Yes, Manu Pabi, go ahead, please.
Yeah, just nice to hear the General and the Air Chief Marshal on the same page there, on a lot of things. And that's true for, larger picture on the theater commands as well. But and huge respect for the Air Chief Marshal, I've followed him for a long time. So the reason that we're discussing this right now is that it's not that we want to discuss it. The point is that for the first time in how much long I have covered defense, which is over 15 years, have such agreements been made public? And that is actually a landslide moment. And that's the reason that we're discussing it right now. And in his speech, the CDS spelled out quite a bit in detail how he sees the theater commands coming up. And we have reached the point right now that if differences over the formation of the commands have to be aired in public, that to me points to see this problem within that decision-making system. And I think, like Maroof was saying earlier, now it's time for the politician to step in, because this is the time to get everyone together. And this is happening under a very strong political mandate. And I think it is now time, because it has become public and so bitter in a sense, that the politicians have to step in and sort out the differences and work it out. And I have no doubt that this will get worked out. And again, I think there should be no artificial deadlines or timelines. It should be done with consensus. And I'm confident that it will come through at some point or the other, with all concerns taken on.
No, but you're saying just because there is disagreement, and obviously, you know, in closed-door conversations, the disagreements have gotten to a point where it's now come out. We need non-military people to come in and help us decide this? Can it still not be resolved anymore? Has it reached a point where it can't be resolved by the CDS and the service chiefs?
See, the disagreements coming to public means that, you know, the topmost formation, the decision-making bodies of the armed forces have not come to a conclusion together. So when that happens, you'll have to look at, you know, a larger picture. You have to think of it as a larger thing which has to be looked at beyond the armed forces. So, of course, the politician has the, you know, they can bring in external experts if they want. You know, there's already a committee formed in which there will be experts from the MEA, from Home Ministry, and from the NSA's office to understand what's happening. But I'm just saying, the point that we are at right now, it means that it's beyond the current structure of the services, which was formulating it. It has gone a bit beyond that. And now it will require some more hand-holding. And because it's happening under the political mandate, I think there has to be more, you know, there has to be more work from that side now to make sure it goes through. They have to smoothen the edges out. Because it seems to me, this public spat seems to me that things have come to a collision course with no remedy in sight, at least at that level.
Well, if they intend to stick to the timeline where by 15th of August they want to announce phase 2 and come out with the rest of the details, then, you know, one will have to see how they manage to get everybody on the same page internally. As we know that, you know, nobody from the services ever wants these things to come out in the media, and I think it becomes very painful for them to see when publicly all of this gets discussed. All three panelists want to comment on what Manu is saying here. We'll start with General Dua and then go to the others. Yes, General Dua.
If I may just correct Manu a little bit. You know, he spoke about these committee being formed, and we are perhaps now we are trying to get the political leadership to give decisions to us. That is not the case. The vice chief committees, the committees that are formed, that's a part of normal process. And as a part of process, we also have to go in for interministerial consultations. And in so doing, we've invited the members from other ministries have also been invited to be a part of this consultation. So this is not as if it's not to be construed as the impression that I got from this statement.
Okay.
It is not to be construed that there is a failure on the part of the services to come together, and that is why these people, others have been incorporated. Secondly, just because a debate or a particular aspect came out in the public, I mean, wrong things are being linked together. There are so many facets on which there are disagreements, discussions take place, and issues are being resolved.
Sure.
The interministerial consultation is a separate part of it and is a part of the process. And I'm sure we'll be able to resolve some differences. Wherever differences cannot be resolved, we are all military men. If tomorrow decisions and orders are placed, then we will work to make it happen together.
Okay. Now, for example, let me just take one thing as an example to Air Chief Marshal. One of the concerns that has been raised now internally and now publicly has been about the division of assets and how Air Force is concerned that assets get divided. The CDS has turned around and said, how is that a problem? Your assets are already divided over your current existing 7 Air Force command structures. So Do you see merit in that, or is that a legitimate concern, Air Chief Marshal?
Tanvi, I have already covered that issue when I spoke last. I said that while it's a fact that assets are transferred even in the present setup of the present command, regional command structure, but there are certain central assets. Now, let me give you an example. Your AVACs, your air-to-air refuelers, your strategic heavy lift aircraft. Now, these are assets which have been already positioned in a manner where they can be used anywhere you want. But what you got to understand is when you say transfer of assets, today, unlike earlier days, and there is a very wrong perception, this term called close air support. The Air Force removed this term close air support many years back, and it now calls it counter surface force operations. There was a reason for that, because today's aeroplanes, it was not like the old times, right up to 1971, when troops on ground used to see an aircraft over them firing across the enemy lines onto the other side. Today's aeroplanes, neither the troops will see them, nor the aircraft will see the troop. They will carry out their task maybe 40 kilometers or 100 kilometers away from the target. So to say that you need an aircraft for close air support is a misnomer now. Because that same aeroplane is a multi-role, omni-role aeroplane which takes off for a counter-air strike deep inside enemy territory on an airfield, finishes that task, gets back. He also has a package on board to carry out a counter-surface operation en route, and then perhaps get back to his base and set up a combat air patrol overhead with air-to-air weaponry. So this whole concept of, there used to be a very common term in the old days. It boosts the morale of the troops when they see their aeroplanes over them. Those days are gone.
Yeah.
Those days are gone. So when you have to divide assets of this caliber and assets of this kind of capabilities, it becomes very difficult. That is what the Air Force is trying to put across, and I'm sure that they'll find a way. It is not that it is an impossible task not to find a way. As we go along, they will find a way. And my only humble request to the government and the military leadership today is take your time, but do it well. Don't hurry up and mess it up. That's all.
Don't hurry up, don't mess it up, and preferably don't bring it out. Resolve it within yourselves while you listen to each other. On that note, I'm going to thank all of the panelists. I'm completely out of time, but thank you, Air Chief Marshal Fali Major. Thank you, General Dua and Maroof, for joining me on this conversation. Thank you, Manu Pabi, as well. Suffice to say, as you heard it from our military experts, there will be a lot of issues to iron out when such major changes are brought in. And perhaps, like Manu was saying, the reason it has come out in public, which military people hate to do otherwise, is because it has come to a point where the disagreements are so large that they don't know what to do next. They are forced to come out and speak. And not just once, not just one person, and not just one time, but now repeated comments have been made in one or the other public place for this story to blow up to become such a big turf war. As we redesign our structure for our armed forces placement, how they strategize, how they come together, where they are based, who gets to command them, who gets to lead them, who gets to design the entire strategy, who advises them, all of that structure as it gets changed under this new system, obviously there will be some disagreements. One can only hope that they're able to resolve them out as they prepare to come up with the next set of plans. Thank you so much for joining us on this conversation.